And so now we got this standard, and this creates this kind of constant state of stress and anxiety for us as little humans, because the goalpost keeps moving on what makes us valuable, worthy, and significant when we learn this system. It's not just that we're measured, it's that the measurement is not defined, not testable, seemingly arbitrary, and constantly moves. And then we can't understand why people have the anxiety, stresses, and challenges that they have. Welcome to the Masterful Man Podcast. I'm your host, Sven Masterson, coach, mentor, author, and fellow traveler on the path to mastery. Every man reaches the point where he knows he can't keep living the way he has been. The question is, what comes next? Here, you'll hear from men who've made the shift, men who've gone from stuck to unstuck, unshakable, and unstoppable. If you're ready to start moving forward, you're in the right place. Today, I'm joined by Craig for a conversation on self-worth, how we define it, why most of us get it wrong, and how the relentless pursuit of external validation keeps us stuck. If you've ever felt like you're not enough, this episode might just shift your entire perspective. Let's dive in. Welcome to the show, Craig. Thank you for joining me today. I understand you want to talk about the topic of self-worth. I'm curious, what made you want to have a conversation about that?
I think that was the sort of sticking point for a lot of my issues that were cropping up really from an early age that maybe I didn't even know about through adolescence and into adulthood and even recently. The reason why I chose that as a topic that I wanted to discuss is because until recently, that was not something that I even thought of as a topic to discuss or to look into, or that had such a impact on my sort of day-to-day well-being.
How would you have said, do you think, in the past that you defined self-worth? For example, a decade ago, how would you have defined self-worth if I just walked up to you on the street and just said, what do you think about the self-worth thing?
I don't know if I had even heard it, a decade ago. I think if you had come up to me on the street and asked me what that meant, I would have probably just said, what I think about myself from a sort of a blanket statement. And then, further on from that would have just been what I believe, societal expectations, the goals that I was going after and how well I was achieving those would have been the yardstick. And I think that's kind of the key thing, is that there was some sort of yardstick or ruler being used, conscious or subconscious, to help me figure out what that self-worth was.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting way to start shining the light on this subject. So you started to sort of tell us a little bit of a reveal about how your self-worth worked. We have to go deeper than that, I believe, to talk about, well, what is self-worth? I would suggest your self-worth is what you believe about your value, your worth, your significance, these kinds of things. And you mentioned that you had, did you say a yardstick? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, a ruler, yardstick, measuring tape,
ruler.
Whatever sort of measuring device you want to say for, how far along, whatever goals that I had at my life in that time that I was achieving.
So keep going.
What I'm trying to sort of, I know more now about this topic than I knew back then. And so I'm trying not to inject my knowledge today that I have into what my thoughts of the past would have been.
Well,
so I know that my thoughts of the past, every single thing that I judged myself on was an external thing that I had done, where none of my self-worth was internal. Or if it was, this is kind of an interesting thing. They were things that I thought that, or that I was born with, that I didn't work for, but I thought were better than, other people or the average. And so that if I got lucky enough in one thing, that I just was, in some ways better than others.
Give me an example. Like what?
This is a small kind of stupid example, but like I was a very fast runner, like a sprinter. I mean, comparative, not, but in my small pond, I was always just faster and stronger than, most of the kids playing sports growing up through high school. So I sort of based much of my self-worth on that thing that really I was just born into that. I didn't do anything to really hone that much at all. I mean, I worked hard, but it was just kind of there. And so, I think for many, it could be economic status, where we were sort of upper middle class at the time, towards the late junior high into high school. And so I think that, not to a huge degree, but I never felt like a lack of anything. I didn't feel deprived of anything. I didn't feel like I needed something that I couldn't have. And so I think that there was some bit of self-worth in that I derived from the fact that I felt like I was well taken care of, and I could see that others weren't. So there was a lot of comparison that was going on in the deriving of my self-worth, which now seems really off base.
Well, I think what happens as you get older, you realize some of the innate pitfalls of certain views of self-worth, because your life experience takes you into places where it challenges your perception of where your worth comes from, and it proves to be feeble. So let's back up a minute. I would suggest that all humans, we have like an inner formula for how we calculate our personal value, worth, and significance. With me so far? I don't think it's very known to us, meaning it's somewhat of a subconscious driver behind why we choose what we choose. I think it's a part of your worldview. Just to use an example, if you grow up in a family where academics are hugely important, then you're most likely going to have a sense of your self-worth that's derived to academic performance. Could be athletics, could be financial, could be your ability to attract people sexually. It could be a number of things. But I find that everybody has this formula. They have their equation for, have I achieved enough self-worth? Am I worthy? Which means that people are trying to pacify or satisfy rather an answer within to a question. Am I enough? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. This is ultimately why I became a coach and mentor, was because I recognized this was my greatest problem, but it wasn't. It was the problem behind the problem. I didn't know that at the beginning, that I had a self-worth deficit. But when I work with a man for a long time, he comes to find out, oh, this is the thing that's always been the problem. But you can't see it in the beginning. You just see the symptoms. So just bear that in mind as we talk, okay?
Yeah.
All of our self-worth comes down to, let's just use let's come up with a real easy working definition. It's how you feel about yourself. And either specifically what it takes for you to feel good about yourself. And I would say that's going to fall into two camps. You're either going to it's going to be conditional feeling good about yourself, or unconditional. So you could say self-love. I don't really like to use the word love, only because in our culture, it's too vague. Like, we say love about too many things. So when you say self-love, some people think, ew, that feels squirmy to them. Other people think you're talking about emotion. Other people think you're talking about actions. I personally like to use the concept of high regard. Do I have high regard for myself? And if so, under what conditions? So if you have conditional a conditional sense of value and worth, then there is a place at which you no longer meet the conditions for seeing yourself as worthy. Fair statement?
Yeah.
Okay. And so if you grow up in a home where, hey, you have to have this kind of grades, or this kind of athletic performance, or this kind of career prospects, or this kind of excellence, this kind of religious devotion, you teach people that their value and worth is tied to merit, achievement, performance, proficiency, utility. You teach people that they are like, hey, here's the conditions for you being valuable and worthy. And then the question is, valuable and worthy for what? Like, what do you get for being valuable and worthy? And I think what anybody who has spent time thinking about this comes to the conclusion is it's worthy for love, appreciation. It's being worthy to live the life I want to live, and all these pretty potent things. So I would suggest we live in a culture that has taught us you are conditionally valuable, and that creates some sort of system to then tell us how to meet those conditions. But I would ask you, what's the problem with that? Or what did you find the problem to be with that in your life?
Well, who's making those?
Yeah, that's fair question.
Conditions. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. We were on this came up in a call recently, but basically when, no newborn has any conditions that they have to meet in order to be accepted and loved and appreciated and by their parent or a stranger. Anybody is going to, if you find a newborn on the street, most 99.9%, to the millionth are going to take care of and care for that person. However, if you find a disheveled homeless person on the street in the same capacity, most people are going to walk by them and pay no attention to them. And so why? There's some sort of like belief system that has been programmed into us where we look at those two people in very different ways. And I don't know. It's a curious thing that happens where we start to just hold people to different standards as they age and get older. And even for ourselves, we start to see what standards others hold people to, and then we are holding ourselves to those standards. And so when we don't, our self-worth then inherently goes down. So
right. Yeah, and that's what I meant by life will eventually test it. So if you have a conditional set of standards for self-worth, what eventually happens to the majority of people is something happens in life and they're no longer able, whether temporarily or permanently, to meet those conditions. Let's just use academics. Let's just say your standard for self-acceptance, which by that I mean, like, I find me acceptable. Okay, that's what I mean by self-acceptance. And acceptable for what? I'm acceptable for my own kindness, again, warmth, appreciation. You have to kind of develop your own working definition. But for me, I have this understanding of regard, the things I enjoy giving to other people and giving to myself. And if I make that conditional, then I'm going to have these standards. And let's just say it's academics, and I start telling myself a story in childhood, maybe because my parents or my culture tells me only A+ students are worthy for the life they want. And so maybe I'm going to have a lot of stress and anxiety about achieving a 4.0 grade point average. But now suppose something happens and I get sick. Maybe let's just use mono. That's a pretty common teen illness. And maybe I'm just too wiped out and I miss a little bit of school, and now I only have a 3.85. What's the dilemma now for that person? Especially if it's happening like right near the end of their, an important milestone like their graduation.
Well, the first thing I think of is it's sort of out of their control. They can't, they have no agency over the conditions in which they're being judged by. There's nothing that they can really do to change that.
They can't change the circumstances, and without giving too much away, you can change the conditions you judge yourself by. You can't change the circumstances that happen to you. And so to the person stuck in that way of thinking, they inevitably become a victim to circumstances because things do happen to human beings that we have no control over. We get injured if we're an athlete. We might lose jobs or prospects of work if we're a business person or employee. If you're a person that really enjoys the attraction of, of women, for example, something might happen. Things happen to us. I like to use the example of Christopher Reeve, who played, Superman in the original Superman movies when I was a kid. And he had everything going for him, like literally played Superman. People treated him like that, this kind of strapping dude, the women swooned over him. And then, I don't know if you know his story, but I think he was jumping a horse and he got injured and became a quadriplegic. And I think went through some pretty dark periods of time in his life because he had built his sense of identity and then value and worth to a degree around all of these capabilities that he had. And then now this happens to him and he has no place now to anchor his sense of self-worth. And I mean, that's just an easy to see example, but this happens to people all the time. Like everybody who has their anchor for their self-worth in something that can move is at great risk because stuff does move.
It's these external things. I deal with this a little bit as a father to, a teenage girl who is experiencing some of these things, because the bar in which you're measured as a 13-year-old girl in junior high, it changes drastically in a 3 to 4 year period of time from third grade to 7th grade. And 4 years is a short period of time, but for them, they are thrust into this different way of life where, you're just playing and having fun with your friends and hanging out, to now you have to dress a certain way, look a certain way, watch certain shows, talk a certain way, be in the know about various things. Now it's having a phone, it's all this stuff. And so I have many conversations with my oldest about this. And so one of the things that I've said to her is, I understand that it's challenging, that you may feel, judged because she doesn't take part, she doesn't have a phone, she doesn't watch TikTok, she doesn't get to partake in many of the same things that her peers do. And so I don't want to say she feels, but there's a sense that her worth is less because she can't have the same conversations about what her peers are having. And I said to her, well, if you took all of you and you were taken out of this circumstance and you were just put on a deserted island and you had no phones, you had no media, you had nothing other than who you are as a person and what skills you had on that island, well, now how would everybody look at each other? And, she just thought about it a lot and it's like, well, how we treat one another. So, well, that's a good place to start and where I would want to be measuring. But, then I think is that even a good place to measure my self-worth? Because no matter what, I think that you can go off on this tangent of one thing becoming the most important. And if you measure your self-worth and how much you help other people, well, there can become problems with that as well. So
yeah, you're pointing
that
to
is this external thing.
Well, let's forget about external, internal just for a minute. I would say if your sense of self-worth is measured in units that can be measured, you're going to be very vulnerable to having a problem with self-worth, because you're already living in something where it's a measurable amount. And then it's, once you add measure, like a measurable unit of self-worth, now you have to come up with a system to calculate that. And that system of calculation means you have to compare. And this is the trap of getting your self-worth in this kind of way. If self-worth is finite and it's acquired, the first kind of existential problem is there's nowhere you can go and say, what is the standard for self-worth? Which means it's open to people defining constantly. And that's exactly what happens. Oh, well, you're not worthy unless you have this latest toy. And maybe that's how it sounds when you're 6. And then it's like, well, unless you have these kinds of shoes or this kind of dress, right? And so now we got this standard, and this creates this kind of constant state of stress and anxiety for us as little humans, because the goalpost keeps moving on what makes us valuable, worthy, and significant when we learn this system. It's not just that we're measured, it's that the measurement is not defined, not testable, seemingly arbitrary, and constantly moves. And then we can't understand why people have the anxiety, stresses, and challenges that they have, right? And so then we try to do our best as like a society or a subculture to define, oh, this is our standards. And I think this even explains cliquishness, right? So, when I was in junior high and high school, you had the jocks and the rednecks and, the metalheads and whatnot. And I think in some ways it was people banding together by what they used to define worth. And then other people were separating from them by saying like, yeah, I don't like those standards, right? I don't want to have to lift a certain amount of weights. I'd rather earn this kind of grade. And then you had people who are like, well, I don't want to, earning worth by grades doesn't seem right. So I'm going to do it by, listening to cool music, right? It's like we start to silo around these arbitrary standards of self-worth or what makes us worthy. But getting back to the point about this, if it's measurable, you're already in trouble. Until you can point to something in the universe that says, yeah, that's absolute truth. That's total fact. You have to achieve A, B, C, D, E in order to have worth. And since you can't find such a thing, now what? What do? You just compare yourself with one another? And I love when people think this is where they're going to go, because they're like, yeah, I just got to be better. Well, there's 8 billion people alive. How many of them do you need to be better to know you're worthy? How's that work?
Yeah, it almost, to me, feels like it's going in the direction where self-worth almost shouldn't even be a thing, because it's immeasurable. There is never an end in sight of, you talk about 8 billion people. Why do you stop, at the people in your community or the people in your class or the people in your town or your state or whatever,
or even the living.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So 8 billion becomes, whatever.
105 billion.
Yeah.
Throughout human history. Yeah. This made me laugh. Go ahead. Sorry.
What small percentage of people alive can measure themselves against this standard of all of human history? And then, why do we even do that?
Yeah. It's from a sense of not feeling secure in our value and worth. This is one reason, side note, why I snicker when people say I'm an alpha male or even use the term, because you could take all males alive today on the planet and very few of them even know how to survive in their natural environment. Like, if you took every man who self-identifies as an alpha male and you just put him in like the Amazon or like the Yukon and just said, okay, we'll see you in a month, most of them are going to be dead. And I'm not saying there aren't men that can't achieve that standard. I'm just saying, like, it's extreme hubris today to think of yourself in the upper echelon of human creatures, since we live in the most pampered, comfortable, everything done for us time in human history, right? Like we literally get our water in bottles that people pre-filter and condition and package for us, right? Same with our food. We're so divorced from our natural environment today. And yet, there's people walking around literally thinking that they're some sort of, Greek god and incarnate. So, but getting back to this issue, the problem with comparison is, where do you stop comparing? And if there are 105 billion humans in human history, roughly, can you find any satisfaction and therefore a personal sense of security if your system is based on comparison? Because just philosophically so, I'd have to be better than all people, demonstrably so, before I could feel quote unquote good about myself. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why it gets sort of scaled back onto, our smaller communities, whether that's our class or our family or our friend group or whatever, because, it's much easier to compare against that size. And I experienced that because it was, the growing up in a small town, the big fish, small pond. I mean, that's the cliche. And then, you get out of that small pond, you go into the big pond, and now you're comparing to a lot of additional fish, and now your self-worth has gone down because you're not swimming at the top of the pond. And that's a problem. And for me, I was blindsided by it. I didn't even consider that to be a factor, because when you're comparing and you're feeling good, there's not even a consideration that would ever wane. And it's very egoic, I think, self-worth I suppose you can have self-worth. Yeah, you can have self-worth in this egoic nature of things, which I think is how most people are operating, or you can have the sense of self-worth in the sort of spiritual confidence type of way that I have learned to be now. And what's just interesting about that is that there's very little messaging out there where the spiritual self-worth and confidence has nothing to do with the measurement against anything. So,
well, for good reason. Well, I say that tongue in cheek. It's not in most people's best interest that you believe that, because you start being a secure individual when you believe that, and you stop being somebody who could be manipulated and controlled, because our entire culture works on a premise of making people feel insecure so that they're pliable to all sorts of things, purchases, utility, right? We put people in basically a giant sense of competition so that we prosper from it. There are people that prosper from that. There are people that prosper from you not feeling very good about yourself. There are companies that prosper by you saying, well, the 10 shirts I have aren't enough. I need an 11th shirt. It's got to look like that one, right? There are companies that prosper by your sons and daughters constantly, infinitely scrolling through their ad platform to see if somebody approved them with clicking a stupid button, right? So you're right, but it's one of those things that our society would have to be drastically different, and I wish it were, in order for people to actually accept that we all have infinite value and worth, and it's the same as one another.
Well, so my wife and I we were talking about this just probably 2 hours ago, and she was saying how there is a commercial that comes up frequently from hymns, and I don't know, you can edit that out if we're not supposed to, but it's basically talking about baldness. And the man in the ad talks about how he's really disappointed that his sex life is waning or going away, essentially because he is bald, and you better sign up for this HIMSS program and get these pills so that your baldness doesn't impact your sex life. So there are two things here. So your self-worth is now measured on your baldness, but that impacts yourself that you're measured on your sex life. And so you have two things working against you. And so we just got into this conversation about there like myriad of commercials and products that go after men and women for these sort of egoic things where somebody who is truly confident, they're not going to be worried about if they're naturally going bald, because naturally going bald does not impact your sex life. And because you would just be confident in yourself, and true confidence is the most attractive trait. And I would posit that there's a person who had no confidence whatsoever, but, you know, the greatest head of hair in the world is still probably not going to have much of an attracted partner.
Yeah.
Or sex life.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got a couple things to say about this. One of them was, and I hope it's okay to mention this without mentioning names, your wife actually emailed me about your episode, or not about your episode, about another man's episode, and really found great relief in hearing it. She was really encouraged by our episode, and I thought that was cool. But it led to this conversation back and forth where I was just sharing some of the stuff that comes up for men, because she, like a lot of women, I think, was a little bit surprised to hear how men think about themselves. And I was saying to her, the context was how most men have no idea that they have an insecurity and emotional maturity problem. They think that they're not having intimacy because they've got extra weight in their midsection, they're drinking too much, and stuff like they're balding. And so I was sharing with your wife how, like, when a man doesn't feel attractive, he goes and does male things, because men are attracted to physicality. And so men tend to think, well, if I'm just some sort of like ripped, shredded guy, that's going to make her sexually attracted to me, right? And we know each other well. I enjoy fitness. I know you enjoy fitness. I enjoy lifting. I'm not some flabby guy who's like trying to diminish fitness. I enjoy fitness, but women are not looking at us the same way we look at them. And so she brought up, and I'm wondering if you could unpack this as an example. She brought up Channing Tatum, and just saying, like, it's become sort of like a thing in your relationship where to like represent this idea. And it was like a way for her to identify with what I was saying. You want to unpack that a little bit? And then I have some more to say.
Yeah. So this was, trying to understand the challenges of, as it was progressing and getting more challenging. And I say that in the way that intimacy was becoming more challenging. Now, there's obviously significantly more behind that in terms of the context of why that was the case. And so the listener could go and listen to the long form podcast that we had that talks a little bit more about that. But
when it comes out,
correct, when that comes out. But like you said, as a man, I was only looking at the very specific things that, like, well, I didn't look like Channing Tatum. Now, I say Channing Tatum because she jokingly sort of would. This is when the Magic Mike movies were coming out. I mean, probably the first one came out 10 years ago. So she probably one time with her sister or something made a comment about him being attractive or cute or something. And I latched onto that because obviously Channing Tatum in Magic Mike is a male stripper, ripped, six-pack abs, huge muscles, dimpled cheeks, just a very attractive man as far as Hollywood standards would go. And so I felt like, oh, well, that must be why our intimacy is sort of falling off. It has nothing to do with the fact that we have 3 small children at home and she's, getting up at 5:30 in the morning and going to work and staying there all day and she's exhausted. It doesn't have anything to do with that. And the fact that I'm dismissing all of that and, we have all these other things going on. No, it's that I don't look like Channing Tatum. And so I have just sort of thrown that in her face throughout the years that I didn't or maybe I needed to. And there were times where I would sort of go on just an exercise binge, so to speak, to try to accomplish that feat and to see if if I do that, will that be what brings her closer? And I did do that, and I got, physically looking not like Channing Tatum, but, a lot more fit. And it really had no impact on the intimacy. So I can say that it was not about looking like Channing Tatum. And yet there was parts of my self-worth that I put into that. And I thought that, like being bald, I am not bald, but for that commercial, that if I could just solve that problem, that it would lead to what I really want. And so I think that's the case with a lot of these things, is that whatever it is that you're measuring yourself up against, it's really that you're trying to fill that in order to get something else that you desire. So if you're a child and you're trying to get good grades, I think that really it's probably respect from peers, teachers, admiration, acceptance from parents, all of those things that, and obviously you might feel like it's going to help you get into there's practicality as well. But from a self-worth perspective, that's different. So I think if distilling those things down, they're many times a strategy towards something else that you're hoping to get out of life or from other people.
Yeah, I like to think of that as a worthiness, which means having worth. And I tend to believe it's worthiness to be here, worthiness to pursue the life I desire. You might call it the opposite of shame. Shame is, am I enough? And worthiness is, I am enough in my experience. And I think when you're a little kid, you start to encounter your sense of shame because you're encountering this capability we have to judge things between standards that are arbitrary. And the problem is anytime you hold two things up together and compare them, there's always going to be something that falls short or becomes losing. And there's no end to that. If you live in a system that's comparison and judgment based, you will always have shame. And if you have shame, you will always have a cognitive reason to disqualify yourself from worth. This is my problem with comparison-based views of self-worth, is they're fundamentally feeble. They give you a basis to have security when everything is going well, but the moment you don't, it stops, right? And getting back to, some of these other conversations, that's just it. Not that it matters really what women want, but I think this helps for men to understand this. Women want to be with a man who feels good about himself. And every man has a set of conditions that he uses to say, I'm allowed to feel good about myself. And so think of that like a bucket that you fill up with how you feel about yourself. And many have asked the question, is there a hole in this bucket? If so, like how big of a hole? How fast does it drain? And who fills it back up again? And so when you have this feeble sense of self-worth, you have a bucket with a hole and you're not the filler of the bucket. Culture is, or achievement is, or things happen that you no longer have the capacity to fill your bucket and it has a hole. Now you have this pretty big problem that you don't feel good about yourself and you start reaching like, well, what else can make me feel good about me? Oh, I don't know. Maybe if she would give me attention. But she's immediately already repulsed that you're a person that doesn't feel good about yourself. So
yeah,
it creates this kind of cycle.
Like, there's the irony in this. I'm not sure how to explain this, but I think it's a problem that I think you must face as a mentor and a coach with men coming into the community, that they come in for a specific reason of wanting their relationship to be fixed, so to speak, and they want that external thing to change. That's what they, generally come into, is how can I change that? I view that as the thing that needs to change. And if that changes, I'm going to feel better. And the challenge that I see, and I've seen go on in conversations, is the irony here is that when you finally recognize that that doesn't matter, and that it is an inside game, and you get that confidence, which is detached from needing to source your self-worth outside of yourself, then those external things that you were more interested in become more available to you. But it's the going first piece of it, and then again detaching your sort of the cerebral intellectual piece away from the fact that you just have to become whole inside, and having your source of self-worth internally, and then you're just not, I guess it's because you're not looking outside of yourself for these other things, that you become a person that just attracts others to be around you.
I would say it's the only path to security. Really, what brings every man into any coaching or mentoring environment is that he has desires he's not feeling like he's able to meet. And he's running into some form of stuckness. And all stuckness has insecurity behind it. Well, all insecurity means that things that could be secure aren't. And just kind of at a philosophical, fundamental level, it's impossible for something to be secure that's not in your control. That's why it's insecure. It's insecure because I don't manage it. And so if you are an insecure man, at the heart of your problem is that you have externalized your view of self. You actually do not derive, you're walking around talking about self-worth, which is kind of an irony and a little bit of an oxymoron, because you're deriving your sense of worth from everything but self. It's others' worth. It's girlfriend worth. It's money worth. It's sex worth. It's job worth. It's toys worth. It's everything but self-worth. And the problem is because of all of those systems that are outside of your control, meaning like you don't get to choose what a person thinks about you. You might not always have an infinite amount of money. You might not always have the best grades. Somebody may decline your sexual advances. Like if your worth comes from those things, now you don't have it. And now you're insecure. And now your sense of self is torpedoed. And so if you were to like look at an average man's life, Craig, most men live in this system of self-worth. It's a little bit like the Forex or S&P 500 or some sort of mutual fund, or it just, if you can plot it day by day, his sense of self and self-worth and his confidence is going up one day because things are good today. And he wakes up and he reads the quote unquote market of his life and it crashes another day. And he can't figure out why he's not enjoying life, but his sense of self, it's not anchored on anything stable. It's anchored on all these things completely outside of his control. And he lives in a state of insecurity. And then he goes about his day trying to manage that insecurity. Oh, I got to get her to feel differently about me. I have to get my boss to think differently about me. And so your whole life becomes given to the service of what the outside world thinks about you. The antidote for all that is changing what you think about you and putting your worth inside of you. Because if my worth comes from within, it's never insecure. It's never feeble. It's not changing today because you looked at me funny or you left, you said something unkind, or because I lost my job, or because...
You were talking with, I find this interesting, is you were talking with Brian in his episode, which again will be airing later on, but in the community, we were able to listen to it. And so what you were describing is the incredible amount of energy that we expend trying to find that self-worth outside of ourselves. And what that does is it exhausts us. And when you stop doing that, now you're able to be much more intentional about focusing your energies in places that you want to, for you. And so again, it becomes this, like, for instance, if money was a way that you valued or measured your self-worth, but you are constantly, just expending energy in all of these other places, like trying to get it, but you're really not secure in yourself. And then you just sort of stop spreading yourself thin in all of these other areas, and you bring it back in and you're intentional about where you spend your energy, then it might, come in great numbers, because you're not spread so thin in all of these other areas, which I think is just, we tend to have many, many areas where we're looking and expending energy and spreading ourselves thin, that it certainly has been the path that I've had to recognize where I just don't want to do that anymore. And it's allowed me to be more focused and have better relationships. And I'm thankful for that. But it's a journey. When you were talking, I also was thinking about, like, it seems as though there is a place where, you're talking about sort of the plot line of our self-worth, and let's call it like the stock market crash, or the self-worth crash. It seems as though there are men that never can come out of that. They sort of get stuck from that crash, and maybe they come up, but they never like exceed their cost basis for self-worth.
Yeah,
And
I mean, they're basically victimized by a crash, and I'll tell you where they usually go. They almost always go into resentment and contempt and hostility towards the group, person, or ideology that they were paying all that worship to. So what happens in a relationship a lot is, let's just say a man says, oh, I have to not be bald. I have to be super fit. I have to be super wealthy, and, pick whatever else. And so he goes through this 5-year ordeal to, like, make himself into some perfect specimen physically. And meanwhile, he hasn't addressed his severe sense of insecurity. And so the woman in his life says, she turns his nose up to him and like, I'm not interested in that, because he's still needy. He still needs her validation to feel good about himself, so he has an external self-worth. And she says, I need space, or I love you, but I'm not in love with you. That man says, what? Are you kidding me? I put 5 years into all of this? That ungrateful bitch. That's how men think. And so rather than seeing that his system was flawed, he'll become a villain, and he'll hate the very thing that he was trying to get to love him. This happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so then you got these men that will spin out, and they become misogynistic. They hate women. To be blunt, they're just mad as shit. And the reason they're mad is because they played a game that was never going to work, believing that it was earning them worth. And again, just to clarify, I'm interested in many of those same things. It's just doing them so that you can have your sense of self is bankruptcy. It will bankrupt you quickly, and it will lead you to hate the very people that you believe you're trying to get to love you, or oftentimes that you believe you love and you don't.
Yeah, and they don't stick. I was talking with my wife about this as well, because those communities that say you should try to better yourself in your workplace, and work harder to make more money. You should exercise more frequently to get fit and be more attractive. You should eat healthy to get fit and be more attractive. You should hydrate so that you're healthier and leaner and more healthy and not as sick, and blah, 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 blah. It's all for external validation. And it doesn't stick, because if you do all of those things and then you don't have the reciprocity from the outside world that validates that you did a good job, well, now you're just going to stop, because you didn't actually do it for yourself. You didn't do it for health. You didn't do it so that you are creating something bigger and better, from a professional standpoint, maybe in terms of helping people and providing more to your community. There are positive ways to go about those things, and then there are negative ways that are just really not done for the right reasons. And it looks from the outside, it might look like the same thing, but it's really not.
It's not, which is why you see a lot of very butthurt people that are very fit wealthy, etc. I mean, they're doing the right things, which, just to clarify, we enjoy many of those same things. But in our community, there's a because, right? It's not in order to reach something. We start with an innate sense of value, worth, and significance. If you're an infinitely valuable human being, how do you want to treat your body? How do you want to treat, what does that mean for your workplace or for your mission? And so it's not that those pursuits are quote unquote wrong. It's that you can't get enough of what you really don't need. So if you don't believe you have value and worth, the solutions to that are never going to be outside of you. And if you chase them, you're going to be really disappointed. Some people chase those their whole lives. I would suggest those are the people that die in agony on their deathbed because they played a game that promised them at the end was some big fat reward from the outside world that would finally tell you about you. But think about the lunacy that anything outside of you could tell you about, like, what you are, who you are. I mean, don't you think it's reasonable to say that your identity, your sense of self, it has to come from within? And I'm not saying relationships don't help us to discover this, but they can't give it to us. But we have been sold this lie that our sense of self comes from everywhere but self.
Well, I just would say the proof is in the pudding. I mean, I spent 40 years. I mean, certainly my first 5, I probably wasn't very aware of what was going on. But nevertheless, 35 to 40 years doing it the other way. And, it still was not until recently that I really had that sort of epiphany that, yeah, I'm good. I don't need to do anything outside of myself to know that I am, worthy and significant of my own love. And that was an important shift. And like there are times you can see it in other people that they don't have that. And I think what's exciting for me in this story, in this topic, and maybe why I wanted to talk about this, is because nobody talked about this, like I said at the opening of this, when I was young. It wasn't something that got discussed. And now I have the opportunity to talk about this with my children so that hopefully they don't reach 40 years old having a crisis over the fact that they were doing all of these things to try to fill that bucket of self-worth. They know it is just inherent in who they are.
Well,
and I hope that we get that message out to more people, and that it's easily translatable. It's tough because it's the message that everybody needs to hear, but nobody speaks the language.
I had a client tell me about 2 years ago. At the time, he said, the problem with this place is that everybody needs it and nobody knows they do. So I kind of laughed because he said, like, this is kind of like a gym for your insides, what we do. And I was like, yeah, I totally get it. But I also reflected to him, it's extremely challenging because we don't know that's our issue. Like I said, I know on day one when I talk to a man, self-worth problem, because I have not had a mentoring, coaching, quote unquote, case or relationship yet that wasn't a root cause. But most people don't know that, because when you're sitting in the system of, hey, this game is not working for me, your complaint is, what am I doing wrong in the game? A guy like me, our community, is going to help you see the truth that you're playing the wrong game.
Yeah.
Totally different context. And it's a bit like Morpheus saying to Neo, like, showing him the Matrix. It's paradigm shifting at first. And so it takes a certain amount of, I don't know, like disruption for a man to even come to the place where he says, you mean there's another way to do this that has nothing to do with this way? Yeah, there is. Well,
so wouldn't you say that, if this shows up in the, I don't know, 400 men that you've worked with, and that is there in every single one of them, then that must be able to be distilled down into like one very specific sentence of where it's gone wrong. Like, where did self-worth go off the tracks? Can you describe that in the way that, just in like one or two sentences, that explains where that is gone?
I can tell you the patterns I see. First of all, you'll never find a 2 to 3 year old with an existential crisis and having suicidal ideation and taking their life. And that's because by that age, kids already innately believe themselves to be valuable and worthy. We actually teach one another first to judge, which is to come up with these comparisons, and then to judge ourselves, and then systematically reject yourself as having not met the standard. That's where it all goes sideways. I'm saying that as a father of 6. That's where I recognize in my own life, but I also recognized it by walking 6 children through the process of watching them be born at peace without a belief that they're not enough. And not until they learn to do this shaming themselves do they experience shame. And then once you believe you're ashamed, it sets the whole thing in motion. Once you believe I'm not enough, you start this great epic search for getting the outside world to tell you that you are enough. And it can't do that. And so that's the common pattern. And it unfolds in different ways. And so the challenge for me anyway is that the first part of my work is sort of finalizing the undermining of a man's the current game, of helping him see that it's irrational, that like it can't end well. If you just watch the rules of the game, it requires total perfection and the ability to meet a standard that you can't define. And you have to meet it perfectly. That's the only way. And so once you see that, then a man's like, well, I have 2 choices. I can keep playing this game and just try to do it better than everybody else, or I can throw the whole game out. And so then you have to help a man understand how to throw the game out, which, it takes its own time.
I think we're wrapping up probably here on time, but I don't even know why this came over me shortly before we started. And the word well-being, because I think, self-worth could be tied to like emotional well-being. And I don't know what the derivative of the word well-being is, but I was thinking about it, and it's like, if you broke it down into 2 separate words, if it was a well, your own personal well within you that had to be filled up, and you're being because of that. Well, if you're constantly looking outside of yourself for that well to be filled up in order to be an okay being, then you're going to be struggling. And so if what you do is just fill that well yourself, well, then your well-being will be okay. So
yeah. So a couple like maybe useful things for the man listening is to try to take some time to understand what are you trying to fill that well with. And the way to do that is to look at what you spend your time thinking about, what you spend your time pursuing and chasing, and what you spend your time defending. For me, I filled it with knowledge and intelligence, achievement. I didn't do grades so much because I sucked at that when I was younger. I didn't do like team athletics, but I did like personal achievement sports like rock climbing, mountain biking, that kind of stuff. And so if I just trace my own history, I could see, for a while I tried this, then I tried this. I got really good at playing the guitar for a while. Like I filled my well by being good at that. And all of it let me down. And so I was in my low 40s when I started to have this like this shit doesn't work. Because the way of our egos and psyches are, I just learned to like kind of say, what am I thinking about a lot? What am I chasing? And that was a way for me to sort of back into, this is where I'm finding my value and worth, especially in being right. And that comes out of marriage. If you need to be right, you're going to have a lot of arguments in marriage. If you need to be thought well of, going to have a lot of problems in marriage, so forth. So that's the first step. Is
the idea is that I think, and we talked about this, maybe it is not about filling your well. Maybe it is that it is always full.
Yeah, I would actually say that. I don't believe, I mean, it's a metaphor, right? But I would say, who told you it was empty? And who told you that this stuff over here would be is what you need in it?
Yeah.
I hold the belief that the well was never emptied. But if you start learning to judge yourself, you start living in a story of disconnection. You start living in a story of not enoughness. But it's never not been true. And the proof of that is we don't have to spend time with a man teaching him how to fill his well. In fact, I'm kind of against some approaches that do that, because a lot of men's work is like, well, you got to get a hobby. You got to go do these things. And those are good, healthy activities. I have hobbies and enjoy them too. But you can't fill a self-worth well with anything but self-worth. And if self-worth is already yours, infinite and immutable, it's already there. And so I find that's a better approach. And when a man gets that right, his hobbies normalize, his free time normalizes, his thought life normalizes, his relationships normalize, because you're dedicating the vast majority of your life to trying to fill a well that's not empty. Think of the lunacy of that.
Well, yeah, it really seems more to me as though, like, if you went about life believing that your well was always full, then doing all of those things, whether it's playing guitar or mountain bike riding or rock climbing or golfing or whatever it is, that you would actually be more expressing this fullness and wholeness in those things, sharing the wellspring of life with those around you through those activities, rather than looking to fill yourself up by doing those activities. And that is a tremendous shift.
One of them leads to exhaustion and one of them leads to joy. I would use mentoring for an example. I mean, there's weeks I could easily work 70 to 90 hours a week, and I'm not fazed by it. And it's because it's the natural expression of me living with fullness. If I ever start living outside of that, I could do 5 hours and be exhausted. Right. And so I've cut a lot of things out of my life that I realized I was doing out of a place of emptiness. And again, there's probably more we can get into in this chat, but one way to know the energy behind what you're doing is, if you're exhausted, you're probably depleting yourself, and you're doing that because you believe you're going to get a reward, and you believe that reward is going to come to you from out there, outside, right? And so I think that's the wrong energy to be in for something like this. You're also pretty preoccupied with how other people are receiving it. So you're very attached to the outcome. You're attached, like, are people enjoying this? Do people like it? All of that stuff comes with it, with the ego, because the ego is pragmatic, right? It's calculating. It's only doing this stuff to get something. So, like, when I play the guitar, for example, and this is one of the reasons I stopped playing the guitar, I was constantly trying to see how other people liked it. And I hated this. It felt like such a trap. It was so good. Like, I hated living in this constant anxiety about, am I good enough? Do other people like it? Blah, blah, blah. Like, I found myself chasing validation. I've done this in a lot of things in life. And it just was joyless. Just joyless. It felt good in the moment because, like, you're like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm getting value. People like this. Look at them smiling. Look at them clapping, or whatever it is. So
it's attachment.
It's attachment. And that's a great way to know you're up in your head. You're doing something from your ego and not your true self, your heart. My experience with doing anything that's truly from your core is it's unattached. It doesn't need to know how it lands on anybody, because the joy is in doing it. It's an expression of joy. It's not an attempt to find it. I didn't know that for most of my life. I want to say that I lived that way probably till maybe 8 or 9. And then that part just got shut down until my low 40s.
Yeah.
Um,
Same. And probably up to a couple of years ago, and in some ways still likely even into the last year, that I was still operating in that way.
yeah, I mean, to be blunt, I don't think it's a binary thing. I'm even aware now, and what I look for is, am I attached? Am I trying to figure out what people are thinking about? Am I thinking about what people are thinking about? That's the easiest way to say it. And if I am, it's an occasion for me to look at myself and say, okay, let's get to our core here. This is an area where your ego's hanging on. And I find, this is just a little bit of a principle, I look outside of myself when I'm unwilling to look inside myself. And so if I find myself looking outside of myself for a definition of my value and worth, it's usually an occasion where I'm afraid to look inside. And that means there's some bit of shame. There's a story, there's some judgment, there's a belief maybe I'm hanging on to that I'm not enough. And rather than look inside because it's ugly and scary, I'm like, no, I can't look there. I'll just maybe try to get you to tell me I'm a good person or XYZ. So I try to be really conscientious of where in life am I thinking about what other people are thinking about? Where am I fixated on outside of me? And when I find it, we learn the tools in our community to address that. And then I work through that. That might take a couple weeks or a couple months. And then I move on. And then, I think that'll be the pattern of the rest of my life. And I would suggest even the human journey is ultimately coming back to the place of total self-acceptance. And I don't know that it happens fully and completely. Yeah, I mean, it's radically changed my entire life. Like literally my entire life changed. My job, my family, my marriage, like nothing is the same. I even look different. I mean, people even, if you look at my old pictures, I don't look the same. It's clear. You can see in my old pictures, like I do not look happy. I do not look joyful. And I'm younger then. And so
you showed me a picture. You're older. Yeah, you don't look the same. You don't look like the same person.
I'm not. I mean, I'm not the same person I was even yesterday. So I do think it's a radical shift. I think connecting with that part of yourself is the point. I don't think there's a greater human experience. Like I have nothing that I would be disappointed if I perished today. Like, I mean, I would feel bad for my kids and whatnot, but I can't explain to you how huge that is. Like most of my life, I was like, but I don't want to die. I don't feel like I've lived yet. And so I had this dread, like mortality, because I spent so much time feeling like I hadn't lived. And I wasn't a bump on a log. I mean, I've been all over the world. I've had wealth. I've had, big family. I've done a lot of cool things, and I was still feeling like I hadn't lived. That's kind of my point. And I hadn't, because I had been chasing this outside matrix of like life is out there. I have to just keep toiling and chasing the carrot. And given
this
all
might
that,
be a good segue into like, perhaps the next conversation of mission and purpose.
We can talk about that. I've got a few minutes if you do, but not. Let's talk about it a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, what I was thinking, it was a good segue, because when you were talking, it made me think that it doesn't sound like you could get to your true mission and purpose until you have figured out the self-worth piece of this.
That is it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because mission and purpose is what you do because, not what you do in order to. So, and same for me. Again, I probably talk about 200, maybe 200 men a year. And all of them, if I spend enough time with them, what you really find out is the man's biggest issue is he doesn't feel like he has a mission and purpose. He won't say it on that first call, but if you spend time with him for a few months, you'll find out, especially once we move past like a relationship challenge, the bigger thing in his life is mission and purpose. Men want this more than sex. They want it more than anything. The problem is, like, there's no way to get to it from living in that matrix of chasing outside life. And that's because in that system, you're trying to get outside to come in here. You're trying to get stuff out there to fill in here. And mission and purpose is the exact opposite of that. How can I take what's in here and put it out there, right?
Yeah, it's an expression.
So it's an expression. It's, from the renewed masculine man, how I talk about energy flow in human beings is intended to flow inside out. But when you're insecure, you're trying to get it to flow outside in. And so if you know what a check valve is, think about the human spirit, soul, heart, whatever, as a check valve. And we have it backwards. When you're living in shame, fear, anxiety, insecurity, the check valve is backwards. It's thinking stuff has to come into me. And so there's nothing can get out. That's why you can't be present. That's why your wife calls you a narcissist. That's why your sex life sucks. That's why you're anxious all the time. That's why your kids feel like they're interrupting you. It's because you're living in a completely backward system.
I have an anecdote to this, which is a good add-on. So working in the insurance industry, when we deal with sewer backups, it is the homeowner's responsibility. Now, that's because you're supposed to have a check valve on the sewer. So if the municipal sewer system backs up into your house, it can't go that direction. And so they either break or they're not installed at all, or they're installed backwards. And so you literally fill up your basement with shit. So that's kind of like what you're talking about, only, from a lack of confidence or spirituality or you're sort of having like, if society is a sewer, it's backing up into you all of this stuff that's really not important.
I would say you're pumping it in, actually. Yeah. And that what we have to do, if you kind of looked at what we do anyway at a high level, we pump it out with the man. We pump all of the sewer garbage out. We hose and bleach down the inside, and we say, look, there was never anything wrong with this to begin with. And then we help him reconnect with that space and learn to keep pumping out the overflow to share with the world. I mean, that's what makes men feel good. Men are made, not that women aren't, but I'm not a woman to speak to this, but men feel their best when they're just giving their best to the planet, to the earth, right, to others. And you can't do that if you feel like you're at a deficit. You're just the way the brain works. You're operating in a gimme, I got to get. And that's where we made men in a state of insecurity, fear, anxiety, shame, judgment, not enoughness. Like all of those just dead giveaway that you've got the system on backwards. And so as soon as that clears up, like men's very next question is like, now I got to figure out why I'm here, which has been his question all along, but he got preoccupied by chasing his tail / chasing the carrot, right? Like that's what's so insidious about living this other way is it gets you on a wild goose chase on a treadmill that you can never reach the end. And you know what? It takes men right out of the true thing we're here for, which is to give, because you're preoccupied. And so a lot of men live this way in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s. Some men live it all their days. Some men, we are meeting a lot of them. It seems like the median age is right around 43. Men are like, wait a minute. Is this it? Is this all there is? Is this all I'm here for? I kind of wanted more than this. Okay. Yeah, we know. Get off the treadmill. And the treadmill it's not what people might call the traditional rat race. You don't have to go become like a person who lives in a van and drives all over South America to do what we're talking about. It doesn't mean you quit your job. It means you address these internal truths that you're a human being. You already have value. You already have worth. You never needed to get any of it. Okay, if that's true and you come to believe it, what would you like to do with your time? And some people might say, yeah, I'm going to start or run an insurance agency. It doesn't necessarily show up as a lot of externally new things, but it's a whole new reason for why. And that's where the power is.
Everybody has I would hope, I guess. I don't know that I could pinpoint anything, but there's times in your life where you can think back on where you were detached from whatever it was that you were doing, and that felt the best. It didn't matter how that was received, it just felt good. And that kind of energy is what, what you're looking for. And that would be the goal, is to get to that point where that's just how you operate on a day-to-day basis, is to be able to live in that way where you are just, expressing and, shining that light out on the world from within you.
Yeah, I would say that it is. And it's our birthright, and it's very possible. But we have to wake up to the, I forget what Morpheus says to Neo when he's kind of introducing him to the Matrix on that like cliff area with the recliner. He's like, this is the world that's been pulled over your eyes, kind of a thing. This is a great movie for this reason, because it's a great metaphor for this. But you have to first wake up that you're living in this whole other way of being, that it's joyless. And I would say your body and your relationships and your life is telling you this, but what do you do with it, right? Do you just ignore that? Do you just numb it, which a lot of people do? Let's just drink, porn, video games, buy stuff. Like, let's do anything. But your emotional life is telling you about the quality of your worldview, the quality of the system that you live in for your trip through the universe. So make it a good one.
Yeah.
But not every man's ready to hear that, right? Most men just like, how do I get my wife to be nice to me?
Hopefully, I feel great about what you're doing with the podcast. And I think that there probably are people having these discussions, but they're not, I would consider myself a regular, average, everyday Joe. And, hopefully it lands with people and they can hear this message and recognize the turnaround. We didn't really talk about the turnaround. It was just talking about the subject matter.
We'll get to
but
that.
It's been a turnaround for me, and I'm very fortunate to have found really like this was the key for me in all of the work. So everything that you're looking to do, there is no shortcut. There is no magic pill. There is no gimmick. There is nothing that is just going to make your life just feel better and awesome and wonderful. It is getting to this state of just, knowing your value, worth, and significant is higher, limitless, and being able to express that to the world, detached from outcome.
I really wish we could do that on day one. But as you know, and this is why in our course right now, it takes about 6 to 7 months to even get to the subject. And it's not because I'm hiding anything. It's because you have to do all this tear down of the current worldview. Like, you have to help people see what they're already like living in. And then the bankruptcy of that. And it's quite tedious. And so one of my challenges is knowing that, okay, if you encounter that, it's going to change your life. But will you get to that point? Because most men, when you're living in that other system, you're in hurry up mode all the time. And so you want silver magic bullets. You want quick fixes, And this is why I think that friend of ours was saying, the problem is everybody needs this, but nobody knows, or nobody wants it. It's like, it's the hardest thing in the world to market. Like, yeah, you want to spend a year completely transforming your life with a lot of hard work, sweat, effort, and pain. Yeah, sign me up. I mean, most people aren't doing
well,
that.
And this was kind of my issue with the term. Are there a lot of men out there even like Googling self-worth? That's what we know to call it, but what does that feel like, from a search perspective of looking into this for
it
oneself?
Doesn't, and I can tell you this pretty assuredly because I have landing pages on my website for those topics. And they're not trafficked to anything like, my wife keeps bringing up the past is my number one source of searches. My wife called me narcissist, number 2. Now, they're actually all self-worth problems, but the more deeply I try to talk about it up front, the less likely it will be that that'll be where somebody will land there. And that's the point of having these long-form conversations, start connecting some dots so that men listening for 2 or 3 hours on a commute somewhere can start hearing something that maybe they've never heard before because it's not talked about like that. I mean, we talk about it like this every day in our community, but you have to get to the community to have that conversation. You know, most people are looking for an immediate benefit to getting in that community. And one of my challenges, it's inauthentic to promise a man an immediate benefit. That, I mean, not that there aren't some, but I would be inauthentic in making that the point. I'm not willing to make our exterior message something it's not. Although I'm still trying to figure out how to do this more wisely so that.
Well, and I can remember writing an article early, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and it was something along the lines of like, judgment is the silver bullet. Like if you wanted a silver bullet, that it was judgment. But really, like, that might have even been 2 years ago. I think really what it was like, it was the internal judgment that I was feeling about not achieving whatever these standards are that I was basing my self-worth on. And so if there was a silver bullet, it's just that, like, you need a Gatling gun.
Sort of. I would say that judgment, letting go of judgment specifically towards yourself is a silver bullet. The problem is almost no man is going to just walk right in and be able to hear that. He's not going to understand. He has to understand what's judgment doing. And here's why, just for the man who's wondering about. Your problem with self-worth is that you have conditional self-worth, which means your acceptance of yourself is based on you meeting or not meeting conditions. And those conditions that you're meeting or not meeting, that's measurement. And that measurement is judgment, right? So I'll use a classic example. I'm 6'3", and I meet people all the time who are like, they feel bad about themselves for being 6 foot or 5'8". It's like, that's a complete bullshit standard. Because I could tell you, I was teased mercilessly for being a tall kid, right? So for me, being tall was not some sort of asset. It was a liability. But when you're stuck in some illusion that, man, my life would somehow be better if I was 5 inches taller, that's what you believe. And so you just created a judgment. You just created a measurement that you said, I don't qualify for something because I'm 5 inches too short. And you'll find, I'm sure you could Google it and find some sort of proof to yourself that, see, I'm really not worthy. And again, it's bullshit. There's plenty of really short, bald, not fit guys who are ridiculously happy because of their self-worth. So the judgment, like the first step is to learn to let go. Well, first notice that you have these standards. Ask yourself, well, where did I get that standard? Who said that X amount is enough? And to challenge why you're living in that story, right? So a funny thing, when I got into this line of work and I was getting into men's work, and I mean, I'm used to being tall. It seemed like everybody I was meeting for one of the first times in my life was like way taller. So I met the very first guy I'd ever met in any of this stuff for dinner one night. We were going to be on a retreat a couple months later, and he lives a couple hours away, and I was going to be in his town. So I'm like, hey, let's connect for dinner. And I meet this guy, and he's like 6'7". And I was like, whoa, I'm totally not used to being around 6'7". And then I meet some other guys who are like 6'11". And I kept meeting all these tall guys. I didn't feel bad about myself, but it was like, I kind of chuckled because of the knowledge of how some people, like, being tall is everything, right? And how here's these guys that are like, nearly 7 feet tall, huge guys, attractive guys, ripped guys. And you know what? Still struggling with the same stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you can learn to recognize that you're holding yourself in contempt for standards and learn to say, well, can those standards be important without being something that disqualifies me for my own self-acceptance? Like, for example, integrity is important to me, but I'm going to accept myself just like I would accept one of my children if they blow it. I still have my high standard. I'm still going to work to rectify any problems. Now, somebody might say, well, doesn't that just make you like weak and a person of low integrity? No, like people who know me will say like I have impeccable integrity, and it's gotten better because I don't measure my value and worth from it, right? To give yourself unconditional high regard, which is to deeply accept yourself without condition, is the basis for complete security and spiritual confidence. And that's the basis for going out and crushing a lot of things in the world, because you're not doing it with this fear that, oh no, what if I fail? You're doing it with an awareness that it doesn't matter if I fail.
It's freedom.
It's freedom. Yeah. That's a great way to say it. So yeah, we could have a lot more conversations about this. I'm sure we will. I'm thankful that you joined me today and recommended we talk about this. We'll probably have a lot of follow-ups with this, a lot of yeah buts.
Well, it's funny because this was supposed to be a short one, right?
Yeah, that's okay. I haven't been paying attention, which is a good indication that it's a good conversation if I'm not looking at my clock. So, all right. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. I'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to the Masterful Man Podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you and you're ready to break free from stuckness, build unshakable confidence, and lead your life with unstoppable purpose, I invite you to take the next step. Join a community of men who are committed to growth, challenge, and real transformation. Learn more at www.masterful.men, because the life you want starts with the man you choose to become.